Uh, Happy to welcome you to the webinar. It's the third in our session this semester, being hosted by the Higher Education and Human Development Research Group here at the University of the Free State. I'm also happy to welcome Amoni Kitooke, who is our presenter today, and he will be presenting on the topic entitled Exploring Community-Oriented Praxis in Teaching and Teacher Education. Also have Susanne Jämsvi, who's our discussant for today. So I think I'm just gonna quickly introduce Amoni, and then later on I'll also read out the bio for Susanne. Just before that, just a reminder to everybody, those of us who are joining online, if while Amoni is presenting or when you're not speaking, if you could kindly have your mic on mute, and then if at all you have any questions, have time for questions after the discussants. If you would rather type something, that's also fine. You can type that and we could read it out a little later. And we'll probably start with the people online if you have comments and questions. So Amon is a doctoral researcher in educational sciences in a joint program of the University of Borås and Lund University in Sweden. He is an early career researcher taking sociological and social stances on education, language, culture, and society. Previously, he served as Deputy Executive Director at the Cross Cultural Foundation of Uganda, President of the Uganda National English Language Teachers Association, taught English language and literature in Ugandan secondary schools. And we're happy to have you, Amon. So you could go ahead with your presentation, and then I'll come and introduce Susanne just after the presentation. So you have about 30 minutes to do so. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Chair Suzieka. Do I pronounce your name well?
Yes, that works.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to get that right, and I have to first start by thanking the institution for hosting me. My relationship with the institution started somewhere in the UK, Birmingham, when I was at a conference with Professor Faith Mkwananzi and Mika Teko Matebula. I don't know if I pronounced the names well. And then we had interactions. We have continued to work together on a few things. So thanks to those. And thank you also, Susan, for accepting to come and hold this discussion with me. Yeah. So because sometimes I speak much slower than I intended to, I thought I should start by saying what exactly I want to say through this presentation, so that if the timekeeper cuts me off, I have said what I wanted to say. Yeah. In this presentation, I just want to say 3 things and hopefully illustrate some of them. The first thing is that when you are a cross-cultural researcher, both your research and yourself as a researcher face some positionality-related ethical and epistemic dilemmas to how to address within your research, but also within your becoming as a researcher. And the second aspect is that my own research illustrates some of these ethical and epistemic dilemmas, and I'll try to illustrate that. I am researching on the subject of community-oriented praxis in teacher education, and the ethical and epistemic dilemmas are illustrated by the context in which I'm researching this. And that gives rise to the second aspect of that dilemma, my experience as a Ugandan doctoral researcher in Sweden. The third aspect that I want to talk about is that navigating the cross-cultural research landscape requires conscious and deliberate approaches. I won't make any claim to saying that I have cracked the code in terms of these approaches, but I try to reflect quite a lot on that. So I will tell a short story about how I came to doctoral studies and this is really a reconstruction. At that time when the events were happening, I didn't know that they would eventually lead me into the doctoral research that I'm conducting. So it's really a reconstructed story. And it's also partly the subject of a paper in review. Sorry, we could not share that paper because it's still in review. My doctoral research, as I know it now, I can trace its beginnings at when I was sitting on a tram, when I first came to Sweden, when I was coming to do a master's in 2019. And when I was sitting on this tram, I entered the tram and then I found a seat near someone else and I greeted them. And this person appeared startled that someone on a tram is greeting them. And they hesitantly responded, of course. And then I was quite puzzled because where I came from, everyone greeted everyone. And my observant eye saw other people when they came to sit on the tram, they just didn't greet anyone else. They just sat, stared at their phone, and well, maybe those who were on the group would continue to chat. Then that was the first incident. And another incident was involved catching a thief, trying to catch a thief in a student housing area. So the incident was that people reported on a student Facebook group that someone entered the kitchen, and a shared kitchen for that matter, and stole their food. They would just break in. And then it became an incident that occurred in several kitchens. And in my mind, I was like, well, this is hundreds of students in this housing area. Why don't they just waylay this thief and catch them? Because as I reflected back to where I came from, I was like, well, in my community somewhere in Uganda among the Bakonzo, and later where I grew up among the Baganda, we would just have to create a vigilance group, not a vigilante, but a vigilance group that would waylay this person and catch them. So this phenomenon got me to think about neighborhood, about who we can talk to. Like when people reported in the group, most of the comments would be like, call the police or talk to, there is a security company called Securitas in Sweden, talk to Securitas every time. And I was like, can't you do this yourselves? Do you have to call on the state for catching one person? Maybe there were many, but it appeared there were one person. Between my neighbor and the state, who is closer to me? That is the question that came to me during that time. And the sociological mind that the sociologist that I perhaps was becoming at that time started thinking about aspects of community. And Ubuntu is a version of the very well-known Ubuntu among the Bakonzo, where we feel close to one another, and certain problems such as catching a thief are addressed collectively without necessarily involving, say, this state security. In fact, for such challenges, if you reported to the local council chairperson, it becomes now a bigger problem than people want to get into. So I reflected on that. And so my doctoral work started really around this kind of reflection. And I was like, being a teacher and in educational sciences, what kind of education leads to this kind of society where the neighbor is either closer to, either the neighbor is closer to me than the state, or the state is closer to me than my neighbor. Like in Sweden, if I had a headache at night, it would be easier to call the health emergency services than to knock at my neighbor's door. At least that's the feeling of Sweden that I had experienced at that time. Maybe even now it is still easier that way. So here, Tony's offers two concepts, Gemeinschaft, which is, I cannot pronounce German. They apparently are German terms. Community, and Gesellschaft, which is society. Again, I can't pronounce that well. And the research groups that I then started working in had a very European take to things, but also even the society in which I'm conducting the research. I mean, this is Europe, but also some of the research groups that I was introduced to. One of the key terms was the concept of solidarity. And the word solidarity had some roots in Marxist ideology, Marxist ideology standing up to industrial exploitation of the workers. And there, workers were called upon to stand up against the oppressor collectively. So some of the words that are used there are words such as praxis, Marxist praxis, meaning action against the what is not welcome to experience. But also beyond Marx, there is Aristotle who talks about praxis as practical wisdom. And in 2024, my colleague and I, actually my doctoral supervisor and I, worked on a paper that reflects on what seems to be a bit of a midway, not really midway, but bringing together the aspects of community and praxis, partly from my experience, partly from the experience of my working context in what we call community-oriented praxis. I'll explain a bit more about that. But here, the understanding of praxis is really standing with someone in their problem, in that sense. That is how I understand the spirit of solidarity. You have a problem, and I will stand with you. On the other hand, community is, you have a problem, and I see it as our collective problem. Researcher Luz, who wrote a business, this is really a business-related paper, but it works with the concepts of community and solidarity, and distinguishes them this way. The communal character of African cultures does not mean that the good of the individual person is subordinated to that of the group, as the case is with Marxist collectivism. In a true community, the individual does not pursue the common good instead of his or her own good, but rather pursues his or her own good through pursuing the common good. If the ethics of a true community does not ask persons to sacrifice their own good in order to promote the good of others, but instead to recognize that they can attain their own true good only by promoting the good of others. In other words, if my brother's child is not going to school, I mean, it is my brother's responsibility, but it is also my responsibility. If my brother's child does not go to school, then it becomes a dent on our family. That's the spirit of community. Solidarity is I will stand with my brother for this term. Next term, they have got to carry their burden. That's how I understand this. But of course, this is up for discussion as well. So in relation to education, I mean, my study is situated within educational sciences. There is Bloomsbury, which is a publisher, is carrying out a series of keywords on different subjects, particularly in teacher education. Kenneth Zeichner wrote a book that is a keyword. I don't know if my video is visible. I should have probably put the cover there. But the keyword community that he presents in this Bloomsbury series defines communities as families and neighborhoods served by schools, and he excludes the broader local context, which is, for example, the town in which the school is situated, the city in which these schools are located, or such. And I have some problem with that definition, particularly the exclusion of the broader context. I look at community as a social system of individuals, social groups, places, and institutions that are situated in a particular context of time and space, especially when they have an interest in a particular phenomenon. And in this case, we're talking about education. Why? Because the family that he is talking about is operating within particular situations. It has relations with particular institutions, whether it's a museum in the neighborhood, whether it's a school in the neighborhood, whether it's a hospital. So their situation is really part of that whole social system. And so working again with the words community and community-oriented practice, as I mentioned, we look, Kathleen and I looked at Praxis as community-oriented practice as practice that is oriented in and directed towards the benefit of local people, places, and institutions. It's really not, I would not see separating either the school from where it is situated or the individuals from that are stakeholders to the school, and for that matter, the education that is happening, separating them from the situations that are, the conditions that are exerted upon them by the local places, institutions, and the social groups that they belong to. So we define community-oriented practice as practices that consider, connect with, and draw on local community strengths, needs, and aspirations for the good of the individuals, communities, and society, either within or by changing the prevailing conditions. That later part is important because that latter part, how do you say it? Latter? Okay. That latter part is of importance because sometimes the conditions within which one is operating are very disabling. They are not enabling of the transformations, the changes that one wants to enact. So it is important to say that you operate within or by changing the prevailing conditions, and that is a very Marxist way of looking at things, enacting change by changing the situations. So the empirical part of my study is to examine practices in 2 primary teacher education programs at one university in Sweden. And here comes now the catch. As I said, this study illustrates some positionality-related epistemic and ethical dilemmas. And I have 3 particular ones that I would really like some help with here, because I look at this webinar also as something that that would help me to chart my way forward, even if in a slight sense. It can be in a big way, actually, I think. The first one is the subject that I'm dealing with. I wonder if I'm fitting a square peg in a round hole by studying this subject, because quite frankly, even at the university that I am researching this, where I'm researching this, there is no explicitly expressed community-oriented agenda, whether in teaching in schools or in teacher preparation. At least I have not seen that as an aspiration in Swedish teacher education or in Swedish school. Although there can be, there might be different ways of saying the same. I just haven't found out that way. The second aspect is the context. Maybe my study would be more appropriate for a different context than Sweden. Is Sweden the right context for my study? Because at least I have experienced and the solidarity focused spirit. And one research, these 2 researchers. One is a journalist and scholar, and another is, I think, a historian and a scholar in history. They have looked at Sweden as a statist, individualist society, where it's mostly the individual and the immediate relationship is with the state. Another colleague of ours in the department, a former colleague, looked at actually this phenomenon and said, well, I don't even think that it's statist individualist. It's a market-mediated statist individualist society, because in many cases when people are interacting with, for example, school, they interact through the market. People choose schools because of an algorithm that is run by a particular company, and therefore you don't really interact with the state. When I call the health services, I dial a number, and in many cases it's a private healthcare healthcare company that is going to offer me the health services. Not always, but sometimes. So it's a bit of a market system there. Even state agencies, he says, are actors in a market framework. So because in some way you can say that they are competing with private entities that offer health services, because in Sweden you can choose where you want to be listed, for example, as your dispensary. It can be a private institution, or it can be a state institution, health services. The third one is the participants. How do my participants, maybe broadly stakeholders in education, relate with my research and its prospective outcomes? Now, I have a tentative response to my own questions. My tentative response is, I think my study is still relevant. And here is why. The conditions that are addressed in other contexts through community-oriented teacher education exist in Sweden. One can observe some urban segregation where you find some. If you are in a Swedish city and you come to an area where there are high-rise buildings, and you will most likely be in a low socioeconomic area compared to where in a villa area where you have like bungalows across, maybe near the ocean or near the water bodies. It will most likely be a high socioeconomic area. So there is that kind of urban segregation, and the schools and other social amenities in those areas reflect that, I would say. So if you are preparing a teacher, it might be of importance to point them to these kinds of dynamics and know that they might meet this kind of children who go to schools in this area or live in this area, might be going through these kinds of conditions. There are also disparities between rural and urban schools. For example, some rural schools actually close because they have too few children. Some of them are multi-grade classrooms. Others are, people walk long distances. So there is still things to prepare teachers for in terms of the kinds of the social landscape that they will meet. And Sweden also has ethnic minorities. I think there is a difference here that they make that is quite stark between indigenous and national minorities. I think there is one group that is an indigenous minority and national minorities because of their history, but I will use them interchangeably. The point I'm making is that there are dominant social groups and minorities. And when, for example, you use Swedish to teach in Sweden, in the Swedish classroom, there is a possibility that some of the social groups are not so proficient. So if a child grew up with Swedish, they will have a bit of an advantage compared to the others. Needless to say, even newly arrived or immigrant children are less proficient, are often less proficient in Swedish when they start, maybe not later in time. I know that I have how many minutes? 4 minutes left now?
Yeah, about 5.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And then there are also religious minorities. The school curriculum in Sweden explicitly says that the value base is based on Christian and Western humanist values. And this means that the social groups that may not subscribe to those values, maybe at home, would have to either subscribe to those values if they're, let's say, to pass their courses, or even in terms of the behavior, even in terms of how they go about things. But this is also not to say that Sweden is not respectful of the different of the diversity that is there. Where my daughters go to school, for example, I am asked to say which kinds of diets they cannot have on their menu. And if I am, for example, from another culture that does not use certain diets because of religious values, then that is respected. But the point I'm making is that teachers probably need to be made aware of these kinds of dynamics. And I'm not saying they are not, but I look at that as educating them in a community-oriented way. What I would like more of, if I had my say, is to say that we could go beyond basing the value base on on a Christian or Western humanist way, because there is more than that in the social groups that we have. And of course, there has been community-oriented historical antecedents in Sweden. The school and the church has a very tight history, and they had a lot of local participation in constructing schools and running them. Well, how am I trying to navigate the cross-cultural research terrain that I find myself in, and which I hope might be relevant for anyone else who might be conducting cross-cultural research. For me, some of the guiding stars are to try and stay curious and reflective about the different worldviews that I encounter and experience, mutually respecting the different epistemic stances, knowing that I come to this context with my worldview, but it's not the only one that is going to have space here. So it's to respect one another, and I hope and I have actually experienced a lot of respect for my own worldviews, and acknowledging the nuances within some of the varieties of the worldviews that, I mean, when I say, for example, Global South or Uganda has a community stance on things compared to solidarity. But once you land in Uganda and you go to the capital city, Kampala, you will have a different version of community stance than when you go to my village, let's say in Western Uganda or to another part of Uganda. So there are lots of nuances from this. The urban community is different from the rural community, even in a Global South context. And then the other thing is to try and sustain my confidence in my epistemic worldview as a legitimate contribution to the discussion that we're having. And I wonder if I am taking an in-between a disposition here that is accepting to be transformed without being derooted from my own roots and from the worldviews that I carry with me from childhood, stepping into new spaces. Because when I go to Uganda, I probably am not the same person that left several years ago, but I'm not completely not that person either. And when I'm in Sweden, I'm not the person that sat on the tram several years ago, and I'm not completely. So I'm really sitting in between, I would say, both in my research and in my personality. Thank you very much. This is for us to discuss. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Amoni. Right on time. We will straight ahead move on to Susanne, who is a senior lecturer in educational work with a focus on higher education pedagogy at the University of Borås. Her thesis, Unpacking Dominant Discourses in Higher Education. Her thesis, Unpacking Dominant Discourses in Higher Education Language Policy, which was defended in 2019, is a critical study of language policy in Swedish higher education. Her research interests can be divided into two areas: the development of higher education pedagogy and language policy in higher education. She has written one book, and she also has a co-edited book, Language Matter in Higher Education Contexts, Policy and Practice. And then there's a fourth coming book, Higher Education Governance, Importance of Language and Voice. Susanne, thank you very much. We'll give you about 10 minutes. And then after that, we'll have a discussion in the room and online as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that presentation. I'm really happy to be invited to this session. I have followed Amoni's work for a couple of years now, and I meet him on a daily basis. And I find his research very interesting and also important. And maybe I should start with your questions there, Amoni. I hadn't thought of that before, but I think I'll start there because you asked, am I fitting a square peg into a round hole? And I think not, because what you are doing, you are revealing what might be covered. If we look at the discourse, and you are here right now, as you say, you're here right now in a specific time, in a specific space, and in a specific, especially in a specific political time, I would say. So my question to you, to be able to also see that there has been transformation in this society, have you had the chance to look at the history and the trajectories that has been taking place in relation to the concept you're actually interested in, like community, solidarity, a good society, and so on? I was wondering, have you had that?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I think it's an ongoing exploration for me, because when I first presented some of my work, I was referred to one very interesting book. I found it very interesting, where the two scholars on Swedish social life, Berggren and Lars Trägård, they wrote this book, The Swedish Theory of Love. That is the English translation. If you read the Swedish translation, it has a very different title.
Okay.
The title would otherwise translate it as Swedes humans. That's the question.
Yeah.
Or as svenska människa, or something like that, as Swedes humans. And in English, it's the Swedish theory of love. And there they look at the social relations in Sweden from a historical perspective, drawing on literary works, but also on different points in time, political points in time. The other way I'm trying to explore that has been to look into school history from 1842, when the first school act was promulgated, at least formally. And then I'm currently reading teacher education policies from the 1968 to try and see how this concept has evolved within teacher education. Because when I presented this during my midway seminar, I had presented in my exegesis school history, but not teacher education history in regards to the community orientedness. So I'm now reading some of these policies to try and understand this. So it's evolving. One of the things that I would like to highlight from my exploration of teacher education so far is the subject of, in Swedish, it's hembygdskunskap.
Yeah.
And hembygdskunskap in English, I would translate it as local community knowledge, where it would be, say, local. Some versions have said local district knowledge, or well, something. But the point in hembygdskunskap was that before you start teaching children concepts in science, for example, they start by exploring the neighborhood. They explore things from home for the first 3 years. And then in the fourth year of school, they go to the scientific concepts. And this is something that started already in 1914 being taught to teachers, and the school syllabus of 1919 started this subject. But it was taken out of the curriculum in 1980, and I haven't really found the reasons behind taking it out. So
and I've got an equivalent reflection to make there, because I want to go back to one of the concepts you use, the concept of solidarity, or the notion of solidarity, because in the Swedish context it actually has got two meanings or two interpretations, where there is one which is a very reciprocal, talks about it's guided by a reciprocal relationship, by where everyone is equally important contributors in regard of a specific context. You learn from each other, and it goes both ways. And it has a very listening and open attitude, something I would characterize as affinity. And then there is this other, it transformed, it was like this in the 1960s, 1970s, but in the 1980s and onward, it has gradually transformed into something that I would characterize as a rather unequal relationship, where one party supports another party, and the supporting party defines how and what to support, and there's no focus on learning from each other. And that way of looking upon solidarity could be characterized as charity. And I mean, those are very contradictory definitions of the same concept. And I was wondering, have you come across it, and how do you handle it in your research?
Yeah, well, I haven't gotten the two versions of it, but I can see what you are referring to as the reciprocity aspect in the earlier versions of social democratic politics, but also social support, the 1940s and around the World War times and the interwar times, running on the 1960s, from the descriptions of education, but also of society that I have read about. And again, the same writers that I read, I think it's Tregod who wrote this book, Civil Society in Northern Europe, and they focus on Sweden, and one chapter in that book is on Norway, I think. So they do that description that is akin to what you've just described.
Because I think there are traces of both, even though I think the dominant part is more of a charity way of looking upon solidarity nowadays, unfortunately. I've got one more thing, or I got a few more things, but that's one I really would like to have a chance to talk to you about. And you said a little bit about it, but since I come from a language perspective, I was wondering how you are going to highlight the linguistic matters, because I've read your manuscript, the one that's out on review now, and I can see that the ethical approval application caused you a problem. It was a linguistic issue, since you had to translate it, and in the translation it was difficult to find the right concepts. So you kind of had to lose some of them in order to be able to communicate what you wanted to say in another language. And I was wondering how explicit are you going to be about the language issue? Because I always think language is intertwined or entangled with all kinds of cultural or community discussions. Have you thought about that?
Of course. I'm having a lot of fun with language, not the very funny fun, but still fun. I am inevitably having to read quite a few things in the Swedish language. I wouldn't have been able to read some of the stuff that I'm reading right now when I started the doctoral journey, and I really appreciate that the doctoral program in Sweden is given some time. If I had to do this in 3 years, I wouldn't do the kind of study that I'm doing. The papers that I'm reading now, I mean the policies, I'm reading government policies in the Swedish language, because some of the texts from the 1960s Some of them are translated and some of them you can machine translate, but it's never the same. So I read the Swedish version, and where I get lost, I go to the machine translation to get an overview picture. And one fun bit also is that one of my participants asked to speak in Swedish because apparently she prefers that. So I am scheduled to conduct one interview over 1 hour in Swedish. So we'll see how that goes. But yes, so yes, the language thing is still something that I have to deal with, and of course I have to be explicit to that fact. And I mean, it's something to continue working with. But my proficiency is not there yet, but I can hold a short conversation with basic words now, but not the very culturally laden concepts sometimes.
Sorry, on that language issue, just quickly, I would like maybe the people also in the room and online, if possible, I'll give you a chance just now, Susanne. Just a reminder that we'll also engage the people online. If at all you have any question, please feel free to type in the chat. But we'll also start with the online people. If you have some question, then we'll get to the room. Susanne, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'll just wrap it up very quickly then. But I think, Amoni, you got both the language issue for you as a researcher, but you also need to highlight the linguistic issue in the content as well. And you might do that. And I've got one small. I would like to challenge you. We can't discuss it here because there's no time. I suppose we need to get the rest of the people here to be able to ask questions. But I would like to challenge you whether you can actually talk about a cross-cultural researcher. What is it then? I know cross-cultural research, but a cross-cultural researcher, and you talk about an in-betweener. Could you talk about it because you want to show that it's not an insider or an outsider, but maybe the positionality of you as a researcher is more a multi-sider than in an or outsider. But we can discuss this after the meeting about if you can talk about a cross-cultural researcher and who is that then.
Yes.
Because if there are other people who would like to ask questions, I'm freely to give time for that.
Yeah, so I think Amon will be able to respond to that. Also, maybe we can at this point have maybe some people online. If there's someone online who would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand, or you could just unmute and then speak as the people in the room prepare. Okay, I see we have some 2 hands. So we'll start with the 2 hands and then we'll move. We'll start with Judith and then. Thank
you very much, Amon, for your research. I would like to understand key concepts, how you use them in your research. Could you elaborate on the distinction between practice and practice in the context of teacher education? How do you define community-oriented practices? That's COP, and is it different from general community engagement? I also wanted to understand how you balance honoring your own cultural epistemic background with respecting the tradition, the context of researching in. Also, how do intercultural and epistemic tensions affect the validity of research in cross-cultural context? How to mitigate this? How can researchers then avoid imposing their own epistemic assumptions when working in unfamiliar cultural context? And finally, looking ahead, how can cross-cultural researchers turn epistemic complexity from a challenge into a resource, not for their research, but for shaping more inclusive academic discourses? Thank you.
Okay, I hope you were able to pick those questions. We had a number there. So I think maybe I'll allow you to respond to Judith, and then we'll do another round.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I will start with Susanne's.
Yes.
Susan asked about how I'm using the word cross-cultural researcher and in-betweenerness. I opened the paper that is in review with this sentence, that knowledge and its development both influence and are influenced by the experience of the knower. So for me, cross-cultural research is hard to differentiate entirely from the researcher. And I teach literature in English. And for me, it's very hard to understand a work of art when you find it lying there and you know nothing about the artist. Of course, you can make your interpretations of what the work of art looks like, of what it is, but that will be mostly something that you draw from yourself rather than close to, it will be very far removed from the intention of the writer if you cannot understand the context of the writer or their identity. So that's one thing that's my understanding partly of the cross-cultural researcher. I mean, of course, we can come across texts, but until we know the history of these texts, it's we don't get close enough to what they mean. And the in-betweenerness for me, if I can see it when I go back home, that probably anyone who moves from the hometown or home village, and in Uganda the big phenomenon is boarding school. After 2 terms away from home, the children are never the same that left. I mean, when I go back to Uganda, I mean, I'm not a Swede, and I'm not entirely the person who left home. Certain things, it's not really culture shock in the strictest sense, but something has transformed. Yeah. And I hope that is, I mean, of course, these answers that I'm giving or the reflections are not absolutes, but this is how I think about things. The 3 questions that I captured from, sorry, I didn't capture the name. The difference between what I call community-oriented praxis and community engagement is that in many cases, when we talk about community engagement, sometimes, I mean, there are many terms that refer to versions of this subject. Some of them community-based education, community engagement, service learning sometimes. By using the word community-oriented, I intend it to be two-way traffic and also situated on the strengths, because engagement to me connotes that the community is out there and we go there and we're engaged with them, or they come to us and we engage with them. So for me, there is something lost in separating the agendas of the community and the rest. Why and what I call community-oriented is that, first of all, the practices that we're engaging in are rooted within the communities. Within the communities, within the social groups and the places. So it's where they come from, but they're also directed towards those communities. It's a bit of a morph there. Compare, for example, the word community-based. It's I find that word a little bit extractive in a way, because I mean, we go to learn about rocks, for example, and we go to a state park or we go to a park, and we base our learning within that community. And we don't listen back to the rocks, perhaps. So for me, it's for me, the orientedness is that it's oriented in, like being oriented in something. Yeah, but maybe it's just semantics, but that's how I understand it. And then balancing.
Sorry, Amoni, I see we are remaining with 5 minutes. So as before you answer the other two, I would just like to maybe invite the other people that wanted to ask, so that maybe as you answer these ones, you can think about them as well, so that we don't
Okay.
time.
I'll
So,
capture them.
Yeah, I could.
Thanks, Suzy. Thanks, Amoni. It's nice to see you again. My question kind of links to one of the questions that Jude asked, and it's about your notion of rootedness, because you said something towards the end about accepting that you're being transformed without being derooted. And I was wondering in what ways you're not derooted. Is it not perhaps better to think of re-rooting, so establishing new roots in the sense that geographically, culturally, and otherwise, as you said, there's a merging of your existing culture and the new one that you're adopting in Sweden through language, through the schools perhaps that children go to, your family physically not being in Uganda but being in Sweden. So there might be new roots that are being established. So if the concept of re-rooting doesn't work, in what ways do you think not being derooted, especially given the cultural, linguistic, intellectual assimilation that has to happen while you're in Sweden doing this work? And thanks.
All right. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I should start with that, because I'm looking at the paper that I again answered Susan with, and I see something that is related to that, which is part of the conclusion, and I'll read it verbatim. And in that paper, I write, the overarching conclusion I draw from this reflection is that a researcher like myself, raised in a global South country and currently conducting research in a global North country, I bring to and find in the research context historical, political, and cultural reference points, both mentally and in behavior. While minimizing ethnocentric interpretations might be an ideal, I posit that there is value in taking such ethnocentrism as a point of departure and carrying it along as one grows into new frames of mind and navigates their new space-time. And navigates their new space-time, relational, and epistemological terrains. Dragging along one's epistemic artillery enables intertwining the multiple worlds of one's existence and action, thereby conceiving a more productive mixture while acknowledging the tensions. My epistemical stance is enriched by the interplay of both the world's views I carry from my upbringing and the experiences of my research context. I do think that even with possible variations, this enrichment is the case for most researchers in cross-cultural contexts and projects. Speaking to that quote, I think that rerouting might be a useful concept, yes, but rerouting might also connote being transplanted into a new space, and you also used the word assimilation in that sense. Sometimes, yes, when people, especially in politics, say we need to integrate new people who are coming to this society, they actually mean assimilate them. But I don't look at myself as that. And as I mentioned, I am not completely a non-Ugandan. I am not completely a Swede. I'm not completely a Ugandan. The Ugandan that left many years ago. So it's really not being derooted, I would still say. But I think I will look more closely into the concept of rerouting.
Or double rootedness, perhaps. Having
Sorry?
roots or double rootedness, perhaps, having roots in both places or in multiple places.
Yes, Susan and I talked about at some point about that as well. And we were talking about the analogy of roots, tap roots and roots that spread across. Maybe that's, and maybe the in-betweener is to capture the double rootedness. I mean, you are rooted here and there, so you are in between, really. Yeah. So I think it's a useful reflection there. And so we have run out of time, but I still had two questions to answer.
Yeah, maybe you can quickly respond and then we can wrap it up.
Yes, so balancing the validity of my research with these epistemic tensions, I mean, ensuring the validity of my research with these epistemic tensions, I think the best one can do is to be reflective about it and show that this is not the Bible truth or the Quran truth about things. This is me embedded in this research context. And I think once that disclaimer is made, I think that's really social research. I don't think social research can claim objectivity in a very absolute sense. That's what I would say. And then inclusive academy. I think I have in the spaces where I work, people are very respectful of worldviews, and I feel quite secure in the epistemic worldview that I bring to the table. And I, of course, learn. I use in this again in this paper the word worldview broker. I'm a bit of a worldview broker, so there is a bit of inclusiveness that is embedded in the academic spaces that I contribute to and learn from. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Amoni, and for joining us today. Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you everybody who joined online and everybody today. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thanks.